This is John for MTGO coming at you with another top 5 deck list. This one's going to be a little bit different than what we've done priorly. I wanted to do a top 10 list this month, but time is of the essence, so we will just settle in for the top 5. We kind of wanted to discuss how the meta is shaping up. Meta really is the top 4 decks of the format. Most people kind of universally agree that the top 4 decks kind of shuffle around just based on the variance of the deck. And then the 5th slot just kind of comes down to, a series of decks. There's 2 or 3 decks that often challenge for the tier 1.5 or 5th top 5 slot. Most of them being Amulet Titan, Yawgmoth, Burn, and decks of those ilk that kind of rotate in and out as the format may go. We take a look at what some of the other lists other people are doing. You'll see a lot of this Grixis Shadow, you'll see Tron coming in and out, and then the various different versions of the different decks that, the Cascade variants, we'll talk about the different variations of 4-color Omnath piles, whether you're talking the Elemental pile or you're talking the Control pile. It all comes down to the top 4 decks are kind of set and they just kind of shuffle around each other, other than really number 1 has kind of been solidified for a while. And then the 5th deck kind of rotates around mostly between Yawgmoth, Amulet, sometimes Grixis Shadow, and sometimes Burn. So if you were looking for a top 10 list, you would probably include Amulet at number 5, Yawg or Death Shadow 6 and 7, Burn number 8, and then number 9 and 10, just kind of arbitrary decks that tend to do well from time to time, but are a little less consistent than the top 6 or 7 decks in the format. Number 5, we're going with Amulet, simply because it is one of the most explosive variants of the deck, and as Francisco has been talking about as the number 1 deck, Murktide has been kind of shuffling things around and started playing Ledger Shredder. There's more opportunities for Amulet to have their explosive turn 2, turn 3 draws, without necessarily having to have a Cavern of Souls and then just kind of overpowering the Murktide players unless they have Blood Moon. And then, beyond that, this is just a deck that's consistently been very powerful and consistently done well in the format. Its results kind of vary as it is one of the more draw-dependent decks in the format. You don't have a ton of ways to manipulate your draws. You're not playing a bunch of cantrips, and you do have some draws that are just simply non-functional, although since the addition of Urza Saga, those draws have become a lot less. It's still a very powerful deck, trying to get to Primeval Titan on turn 3. Sometimes as crazy as turn 2. I just played a league with Burn the other night where I ran into a turn 3 kill and then a turn 2 kill that was like double Primeval Titan, Cultivator, Colossus, and they just kind of went nuts with multiple amulets and killed us. So, it is a deck that does have that turn 2, turn 3 combo ability and still has the ability with multiple Cultivator Colossi to play long games against decks like 4-color Control and Murktide, as well as Cavern of Souls to kind of blank counter spells, which is one of the best ways to combat the pile. I'm going to cut to the chase and talk about our number 1 deck, and that being Is It Murktide? So the reason why I'm cutting to the chase and doing Murktide number 1, we've already kind of mentioned it. Number 2, there are a couple different variants of the deck, mostly revolving around how many copies of Dragon Rage's Chainlore you're running and how many copies of Ledger Shredder you are running. Most decks have preferring to run more copies of Ledger Shredder lately, although it's still sometimes occasionally you'll see the 4 Dragon Rage's Chainlore, 4 Ragavan, 4 Murktide version, or say 3 Dragon Rage's Chainlore, like 2 Ledger Shredder and 3 Murktide. People are getting a little bit cute, I think, somewhat by going down to 3 Murktide, because it's the proper number according to math or whatever, how many cards the deck sees. But I still think Murktide is the number 1 threat in the deck, and you need to be aware of it. Ragavan, obviously the deck could operate without it. Even with the banning of something like Ragavan, the deck would still be quite good, as it would simply slot Dragon Rage's Chainlore back into the thing. But with the diminishing of Dragon Rage's Chainlore and the increase of Ledger Shredder, it is a little less susceptible to graveyard hate. Things like Rest in Peace, Endurance, and such used to be very good against this deck, and while it still does a very good job of kind of stifling what the deck's trying to do, Ledger Shredder and Ragavan do give it a series of resilient threats that aren't necessarily reliant upon the graveyard. This is a deck that sees a ton of cards, plays a bunch of counter spells, plays a bunch of cheap interaction, and there are very few decks in the format that can stand up to it toe-to-toe. One of the decks on this list does a very good job of standing up to it, but has a little bit weaker matchup across the field, and for that reason, Murktide is number 1. And then let's go back down and talk about number 4. Number 4 is Hammer Time. This is a combo deck that is kind of the spiritual successor to Death and Taxes. In fact, and all these various different decks kind of coalescing into one thing. It's mainly built around the combo of Colossus Hammer, along with Pure Steel Paladin and Sigarda's Aid to be able to equip it for cheaper than its equip cost. You also have copies of Urza's Saga to find your copies of Colossus Hammer. So much like a deck like Amulet, it benefits from having more copies of its namesake card. Sometimes we'd have to play things like Steel Shaper's Gift or Stoneforge Mystic to find it. Now it can literally play an uncounterable way to find a Colossus Hammer, and just needs to find a way to resolve either a Sigarda's Aid or a Pure Steel Paladin, kind of go to town. That said, it also has this kind of like backup beatdown plan. Some versions run Esper Sentinel, some run Stoneforge Mystic, some run other creatures that are a little bit more resilient to what's going on. This just happens to be the mono white version. You see a lot of versions with running the blue that running Spell Pierce and stuff. Not Steel Shaper's Gift. The Blacksmith's Skill is another way to protect its things. Some of the versions also happen to run the 7-mana Caldera Complete, in addition to Nettle Assist and Sword of Feast and Famine, which turns Stoneforge Mystic into a threat on its own that must be answered. So this is a deck that has run the gamut of different things, but is a little bit weaker than the top two, or number 2 and number 3 that we'll talk about here in 1 second. Number three is Living End, but this kind of represents the twin towers that are Living End and 4-color Rhinos. These kind of decks kind of interchange depending on the hate that you're expecting to see. If you're expecting to see, a bunch of Endurances, a bunch of Rest in Pieces, a bunch of Lanterns, Tormods, Crypts, a little bit less the hate card that Burn tends to run, Sanctifier and Vec, but you still run into a bunch of different decks that are trying to target this sometimes, and usually when it has a good finish, or if Dredge happens to rise up and have a good finish, this deck gets targeted a little bit by hate, and a lot of people are running incidental hate cards for graveyards simply because of Murktide, especially Endurance happening to be quite good. That said, this deck can play through things like Endurance and stuff, and has a very good Game 1 against a lot of decks, simply because there aren't a lot of decks that are built to interact with this Game 1. Especially when you put in things like Grief and Force of Negation, potentially able to force through an opponent's lone counterspell in game number 1. This is often a game-ending spell on game 1. And then game 2 and game 3, you have different ways to fight your opponent's hate cards, whether they be permanent-based hate cards or additional counterspells to fight your opponent's counterspells. You also have things like Ley Line of Sanctity, fight opposing Endurances, as well as burn spells, making it incidentally good against burn, and a matchup that would sometimes be a struggle in those situations. But overall, these are kind of two interchangeable decks that you put at number 3, that being both blue 4-color Living End and Temur Rhinos, with Living End being a slightly more powerful deck, hence why it's on number 3 on this list currently. Number 2 on the list is the 4-color Yorion Piles. This is a deck that is a little bit weaker to the extreme ends of the format. It's weak to things like Burn, it's weak to decks like Storm, the very fast combo or aggressive decks, or the go-over-the-top decks like Tron. But everything in the middle, everything from Death Shadow and Murktide, all the way up to a deck like, say, 5-color Niv, if that's on much play. This deck is very good to fight that kind of fight. It has a ton of card advantage, has a ton of early interaction, although not the best at dealing with threats on turn 1 and turn 2 sometimes. And, plays either a set of counter spells or a set of Eldamari's Calls and Risen Reefs, depending on what you expect to see out of your opponent's meta. Risen Reef, it becomes a little bit more of a grindier elemental package. With Counterspell, it gives them a little bit more outs against some of the more difficult matchups, especially spell-based combo or decks like Tron, giving you a counterspell and the potential other hate cards. That said, it is an 80-card Yorion pile, so you don't always find the hate cards you want with any type of consistency, although Eldamari's Call and the sheer amount of cantripping in this deck allows you to have very good looks at cards throughout your deck with Expressive Iteration, Teferi, Omnath, all these various different cards, drawing you cards, Iceman Guadal, just so many different cantrips in this deck. Even though you are an 80-card deck, you really function like a 60-card deck a lot of the times. This deck also happens to have a decent matchup against Murktide, which is more than most of the format can say. So that's one of the main reasons that it sees play, is it's one of the few decks that can kind of go toe-to-toe with Murktide and actually come out on top. But, like I said, take a look at the top meta. Number 1 is definitely Murktide, but there's definitely a couple different variants of that. Number 2 is the Yorion piles, whether it be the Elemental piles or whether it be the 4-color Omnath control piles. Number 3 is obviously the various Cascade decks. All of the course we're mainly talking about Temur Rhinos and Living End being slightly better. And, we're talking about Hammer Time and Amulet being the 4th and 5th best decks. But if you actually extrapolate those out, that's probably like the top 6 or 7 decks. Then you throw in Grixis, Death Shadow, Burn, Yawgmoth. Those are kind of the decks that are at the top of the format right now. Other decks you might see floating around. You might see Tron floating around. And then you start getting into a bunch of other decks that see a little bit of fringe play. But those are definitely the decks that you should be expecting to see in big events, mainly the top 5, but also some of the other ones that we were just talking about. And another deck that's starting to pop up is both the Creativity Piles and Re-Engineered by Gabe Nassif, and then the Red-Green Scapeshift decks kind of pop up now and again. It's kind of another Tron-esque strategy that can ignore a lot of what's going on with some of the top decks in the format, but still has some weaker matchups like decks like Burn and stuff that can definitely cause them problems. But, it's kind of a look at a top 5 of the meta while also discussing the decks surrounding it. So while we didn't do an official top 10 list, this is definitely a listing of the top 5-ish decks in the format, but we did talk about the top 10 overall. So this has been John for MTG Nexus. Hope to see you for the next video.